Hello. Today I want to discuss some of the most incredible information I've come across recently. Basically, I've come across a meta-analysis that looks into 22 studies, and it basically tells you every single thing you need to know about how to build muscle effectively whilst investing the least amount of time possible. Now, despite a few outliers in the data, i.e. genetic freaks, probably 1% of you, this information will work for nearly every single human. So now, remember, this study discusses strictly hypertrophy, not strength building, not strength and muscle gain simultaneously, only muscle growth. So let's discuss some things before we get into the most efficient protocol for building muscle. Now, focusing on putting as much tension over time on the target muscle, and I'm not talking in one set in an entire workout, I'm talking over a massive period of time, over weeks, over months. This is what's going to help you build muscle. Isolating the muscle specifically, not utilizing joints or connective tissue, but more so controlling the weight and feeling the muscle worked and not letting it have any time to rest besides during your rest periods, which are generally going to be 2+ minutes. And this study suggests that if you work out and you rest for 1 minute, you're going to have to do twice as much volume to get the same muscle gain, because your volume is going to be diminished because your strength will be diminished because you're not resting enough, basically. Now, this brings me to my next point. So we're going to want to place a very heavy emphasis on bodybuilding technique. What is bodybuilding technique? Well, I'll give you an example. Let's say you're doing bench press. You start in that top position, correct? Now, you slowly lower the weight, 2 to 4 seconds on the eccentric, and I'm not talking about letting the weight drop on you like a lot of people do in the gym, nearly every single person who doesn't know this stuff. Controlling the weight on the way down, stretching for a moment, and pausing, and then exploding outwards. And now you may lock out at the top of the movement, but make sure that you're not resting your muscles in that top position. Maybe if you're at the very end of a set and you want to cheat, it is what it is. But ideally, you're never going to let your muscle rest when you're doing a set. That is key. By exploding outward and not letting yourself pause at the top, you are going to continuously put tension onto your muscle. And that is what we're aiming for. We are focusing on the most tension on the muscle as possible. We're not focusing on how many reps can I do. We're not focusing on simply getting the weight up and not giving a fuck about the eccentric. It is paramount that you follow this technique. So let's reiterate. You starting position, slowly lower, 2 to 4 seconds on the eccentric, whatever you're comfortable with, whatever you want to do in the time. Pause, get that stretch, and explode outward. And then before you fully squeeze and start resting at the top, you're gonna start going back down on the eccentric, and you're gonna do that anywhere from 6 to 30 times, as whatever you're comfortable with. Hypertrophy has been shown to occur within a rep range of 6 to 30. Strength, 1 to 5. By doing this sort of technique, we are maximizing the tension on the muscle. And if you think long term, weeks, months, years, you're doing something right. You're going to make progress no matter what. Now, one thing that I've noticed, resistance in the stretched position on the eccentric and stretching is potentially even more important than simply getting the weight up and repping. What most people are doing in the gym is they're simply trying to get the weight up. They do not give a fuck about the eccentric. They do not care about pausing and stretching. None of that. It is more like push, hold, go back down immediately, push, hold. That's not an effective way. You will grow doing that. That's not an effective way to grow, however. You're going to be missing out on a lot of tension if you're doing something like that. Now, I'm a big believer that the eccentric part and controlling the weight on the way down is equally, if not way more important than pushing the bar up and simply getting the rep, as people say. So now this brings me to the study. Let's get into the meat and potatoes of this shit. So, on average, hypertrophy appears to increase with... Holy shit, I can't speak. On average, hypertrophy increases drastically when working with volumes of 6 to 8 hard sets per muscle group in a single training session when taking 2+ minute rests in between. This basically means for beginners, you could get about 10 sets per week to experience maximum muscle growth. For intermediates, about 15. For experts and super trained, potentially professionals, for advanced individuals, you're going to be looking at about 20+ sets per week of these hard sets. Now, for 90+% of you, you're simply going to have to hit 5 sets, 6 sets per muscle group. Very simple. About 2 really difficult sets per specific muscle. So let's say you're doing bench press, let's say you're doing incline, and then let's say you're doing flies or decline or something like that. Now, that's going to do a lot of work to your mid chest, but what I'm getting at is with the regular flat bench press, you're going to be working your middle muscle 2 times, really hard sets, not counting warm-ups. With the decline, you're going to be working your pectoralis minor, I believe that's what it's called. And then with the incline, you're going to be working your clavicus. And throughout all of these movements, you're going to be using different parts of your chest. That should be pretty good, which means you could spend like 30 to 45 minutes in the gym and get the fuck out of there. That's pretty legit. And this is great news because at a certain point, the amount of work that you're doing, it begins to diminish. It's like a logarithmic scale. Now, let me show you what that looks like. It's going to look something like this. You're basically going to get the most bang for your buck in this 6 to 8 sets per muscle group range. As you can see, so these are trained subjects, these are untrained subjects, these are, I'm assuming, intermediate people. There is a drastic fall off after about 8 sets per muscle group. You're basically doing junk volume, and you're basically going to be getting the same exact gains. So if you're focused on doing getting the most bang for your buck, the least time investment for the most outcome, you're going to want to do 6 to 8 really hard sets per muscle group. Now, if you're breaking your stuff up into like chest and try, for example, that means chest, I already gave you, incline, flat bench, decline. You could throw in some flies or something if you want in there. 2 really hard sets of those. Now, if you're like me, you might do 3 really hard sets of flat bench, 3 really hard sets of incline, and then 1 really hard set of decline, because I just don't care that much about decline. My gym kind of has a shitty decline bench. Like one of flies. And it turns out you don't need to spend 4 hours in the gym to become a fucking Greek god. This is fucking great news. Now, when I say a working set, what does that mean? A working set is not a warm-up. I am talking 95 to 100% effort. Nearly failure, if not failure on the last one that you do. Now, you should ideally be getting as close to failure in at least one of your sets per exercise. So what can we take from this? You want to do about 6 sets per muscle group, 6 to 8 sets. Honestly, 5 is good if you're a beginner. Like, you are going to get basically all the value that you can out of the exercise. If you're focusing on tension, if you have good technique, and you're following this type of a regimen, I 100% guarantee you will build muscle. Why? Because I've built muscle doing this. Now, don't be like me, because you see, sets per muscle per session. This is referring to per muscle group. Please do not be like me and do 6 sets per muscle, because I interpreted this information really, really poorly until I went back and looked at this study and read this stuff. So, now, what does this chart give us? It's stating 10 plus sets per muscle group per week is going to get you about double the result as 5 to 9 sets per muscle group on average. Now, this might seem a little crazy because it's 5 to 9 weeks, but I'm sure it's factoring in the lower end of that threshold. So this is the average. You're going to, as a beginner, 10 sets per week per muscle group, and you're fucking golden. As an intermediate, maybe 15. As an advanced, maybe 20. And also, depending on your specific genetics, which is what this states here, regardless of training volume, genetics play a strong role in hypertrophy. People who respond well to low volume will also tend to respond well to high volume. And people who don't respond well to low volume will likely still be a low responder to high volume, but it will have a greater effect. It doesn't really matter how much volume you're doing, as long as it's in this 6 to 8 set range per muscle group. That is the key takeaway. Now, I have a little anecdote. I once asked the super buff guy at the gym, his name was Jonathan, what he does to build muscle. And he suggested to me 2 to 3 working sets. And as it turns out, according to this research, that is pretty congruent with the information in this study. Now, I've basically given you every single thing you need to grow. I want to add a little bit of stuff at the end. If you ever end up hitting a plateau with this information, here are some things you can keep in mind to progressively overload and basically ensure that you're getting better over time. Now, you can add reps to the same weight. And actually, I forgot this. I should mention, you should be doing anywhere between 6 to 30 reps, but ideally, doing 30 reps is really fucking grueling, okay? So ideally, try to aim for 8 to 12. That's a pretty good range. If you're doing 15, that's fine. As long as you're focusing on tension that entire time, but obviously it can be much more difficult to focus on tension when you're doing 30 reps. So keep that in mind. Now, you can add reps with the same weight. You can add small incremental weight once you hit like 12 or 15. You could add 2.5 on each side and just work on that. And lastly, you could focus on the technique. You could do accessory movements such as stretches to increase your range of motion. You can focus on pausing and stretching the muscle whilst not letting yourself rest when squeezing. That thing I was describing earlier. You don't necessarily want to hold the weight and let your muscle rest. You want to be fucking repping like Ronnie Coleman. Now, that's not to say you just push the weight and you let it go back down. You're going to push and control. And pause, stretch. Push. Don't let yourself rest like crazy, but make sure you get that squeeze. Eccentric. Got it? Got it. Focus on the eccentric and really exploding on the concentric. And that is like 60 to 75% of technique when people are discussing that. And despite contrary to popular belief, training with intensity is not screaming and pushing as hard as you can. It is performing with good technique. That is what counts. It is not the level of perceived effort you're putting in. It is the technique and what you're actually doing to the muscle. It does not matter what you think up here, what you feel up here. It matters what you're genuinely doing to create the adaptation to its fullest. Now, if you notice that you're gaining strength in terms of reps, this is generally a really good indicator that the muscle is growing, because you're not necessarily training for strength with this technique. So that's your positive reinforcement right there. That's how you know it's working. Now, some helpful ideas before I leave you. Cables and machines will allow you to further isolate the muscle rather than compound movements with a barbell, for example, which will indeed engage stabilizer muscles, which, if we're talking strictly for hypertrophy, there's a slightly diminished effect. However, it's not going to be very much of a big deal. If you like doing flat bench press with a barbell, go for it. You're not going to be missing out on much. But cables and machines tend to be superior. So keep that in mind when it comes to maximizing tension on the muscle. Now, I'm not saying the barbell bench press is bad for hypertrophy. Strictly speaking, in terms of maximum muscle growth, it will have a slightly lesser effect due to the broad use of muscles and not just isolating one specific muscle, for example. So, don't get me wrong, I absolutely love the bench press, and I'm not going to stop doing it with the barbell because of this study. Do what works for you. Find out what you enjoy so that you could sustain that level of effort over a long period of time. Because it doesn't matter if you have a couple good workouts in 10 good workouts. 50 terrible workouts are still going to drastically outpace 10 good workouts. It matters the consistency, not the perceived level of effort and what's going on here. Now, lastly, this isn't very important, but I will leave you with this. Stimulus to fatigue. Going to failure on every single set is going to impact your overall volume, which means you're doing less overall work to stimulate the muscle. So be careful of doing things like squatting to failure or deadlifting to failure on every single set because it's going to wear you out. It's probably a great thing to do as your last exercise to really fatigue yourself and work the muscle before you leave the gym. But if you're doing it first, it's going to impact your overall volume, which is going to leave you leaving gains on the table. None of us want that. This whole video is about not leaving gains on the table. So, if you enjoyed this, if this information was helpful, please leave me a like. Please subscribe for more content. Leave a comment if this was useful and tell me what you want to hear more about. Hell, fucking be the first person for me to turn on notifications. Also, like, 95% of you are not subscribed. So, please do me a fucking favor and subscribe, because when I have more subscribers and more people click on this stuff, it motivates me more to actually put out this information. And if this information is, like I think, useful, well, then that just benefits the whole world. So, that's all I got for you. I really hope you enjoyed this, and I believe in you. You're going to become a fucking Greek god one of these days. Just apply some of this information, and you'll be fucking chilling. That's all. Goodbye.